Hello and welcome to Cloud Learner's Journey Part 4 of Azure Solutions Architect Real Exam Questions and Answers with Explanation. You can also find reference links in the description. To become an Azure Solutions Architect, you must pass AZ-104 and AZ-305 exam. You can also go through AZ-104 exam video series and links are available in the description. If you like the video, please like, share, comment and subscribe to our Cloud Learner's Journey channel to help you pass AZ-305 exam and become an Azure Solutions Architect. Question number 1. You are designing a microservices architecture that will be hosted in an Azure Kubernetes Services cluster. Apps that will consume the microservices will be hosted on Azure virtual machines. The virtual machines and the AKS cluster will reside on the same virtual network. You need to design a solution to expose the microservices to the consumer apps. The solution must meet the following requirements. Ingress access to the microservices must be restricted to a single private IP addresses and protected by using mutual TLS authentication. Second requirement, the number of incoming services calls must be rate limited. Third requirement, cost must be minimized. What should you include in the solution? And the options are A. Azure App Gateway with Azure Web Application Firewall WAF. Option B. Azure API Management Standard Tier with a service endpoint. C. Azure Front Door with Azure Web Application Firewall. D. Azure API Management Premier Tier with Virtual Network Connection. And the correct option is D. Azure API Management Premier Tier with Virtual Network Connections. Azure API Management Premier Tier supports virtual network integrations which allow you to restrict ingress access to the microservices to a single private IP address within the virtual network. This tier also supports mutual TLS authentication, rate limiting policies, and provides a solution while minimizing costs. Next, question number 2. You plan to create an Azure Solution account that will be host file shares. The shares will be accessed from on-premises applications that are transaction intensive. You need to recommend a solution to minimize latency when accessing the file shares. The solution must provide the highest level of resiliency for the selected storage tier. What should you include in the recommendation? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Answer area for storage tier, options are hot, premium, transaction optimized. For redundancy, options are Geo Redundant Storage, which is GRS, Zone Redundant Storage, ZRS, and Local Redundant Storage, LRS. Correct options are for storage tier, it's premium. Premium file shares are backed by solid state drives and provide consistent higher performance and low latency within a single digital milliseconds for most 10 operations for 10 intensive workloads. For redundancy, the correct option is Zone Redundant Storage. Azure FileShare only supports LRS and ZRS. With zone redundant storage, 3 copies of each file stored. However, these copies are physically isolated in 3 distinct storage clusters in different Azure availability zones. Next, question number 3. You are designing a data storage solution to support reporting. The solution will ingest high volumes of data in the JSON format by using Azure Event Hubs. As the data arrives, Event Hubs will write the data to storage. The solution must meet the following requirements. Organize data in directories by data and time. Second requirement, allow stored data to be queried directly, transformed into summarized tables, and then stored in a data warehouse. Third requirement, ensure that the data warehouse can store 50 TB of relational data and support between 200 and 300 concurrent read operations. Which service should you recommend for each type of data stored? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Answer area for data stored for the ingested data, options are Azure Blob Storage, Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, Azure Files, Azure NetApp Files. And for data stored for the data warehouse, options are Azure Cosmos DB Cassandra API, Azure Cosmos DB SQL API, Azure SQL Database Hyperscale, Azure Synapse Analytics Dedicated SQL Pool. And the correct options are for data stored for the ingested data, Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. Azure Data Lake Storage is optimized storage for big data analytics workloads. You can analyze and query data without prior ingestion into Azure Data Explorer and can also query across ingested and uningested external data simultaneously. And for the answer area, data stored for the data warehouse, and the correct option is Azure SQL Database Hyperscale. Azure SQL Database Hyperscale is optimized for OLTP and high throughput analytics workloads with storage up to 100 TB. Next, question number 4. Your company has divisions shown in the following table. Columns are division, Azure subscription, Azure Active Directory tenant. For East division, and the subscriptions are sub 1 and sub 2 with Azure AD tenant east.contoso.com. And for West division, subscriptions are sub 3 and sub 4, and Azure Active Directory tenant is west.contoso.com. You plan to deploy a custom application to each subscription. The application will contain the following: a resource group, an Azure web app, custom role assignments, an Azure Cosmos DB account. You need to use Azure Blueprints to deploy the applications to each subscription. What is the minimum number of objects required to deploy the application? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. For management groups, it's 2. One management group for each AD tenant. Azure management groups provide a level of scope above subscription. All subscriptions within a management group automatically inherit the conditions applied to the management group. For blueprint definitions, it's 1. One single blueprint definition can be assigned to different existing management groups or subscription. For blueprint assignments, it's 2. Each published version of a blueprint can be assigned with a maximum name length of 90 characters to an existing management group or subscription. Assigning a blueprint definition to a management group means the assignment object exists as the management group. Next, question number 5. You plan to deploy an Azure SQL database that will store personally identifiable information. You need to ensure that only privileged users can view the PII. What should you include in the solution? And the options are: A. Dynamic data masking, B. Role-based access control, C. Data discovery and classification, D. Transparent data encryption DDE, and the correct option is A. Dynamic data masking. Dynamic data masking limits sensitive data exposure by masking it to non-privileged users. Next, question number 6. A company named Contoso Limited has an Azure Active Directory tenant that is integrated with M365 and an Azure subscription. Contoso has an on-premises identity infrastructure. The infrastructure includes servers that run Active Directory domain services and Azure AD Connect. Contoso has a partnership with a company named Fabricam. Fabricam has an Active Directory Forest and a Microsoft 365 tenant. Fabricam has the same on-premises identity infrastructure components as Contoso. A team of 10 developers from Fabricam will work on an Azure solution that will be hosted in the Azure subscription of Contoso. Developers must be added to the contributor role for a resource group in the Contoso subscription. You need to recommend a solution to ensure that Contoso can assign the role to the 10 Fabricam developers. The solution must ensure that the Fabricam developers use their existing credentials to access resource. What should you recommend? And the options are: A. In the Azure AD tenant of Contoso, create cloud-only user accounts for the Fabricam developers. B. Configure a forest trust between the on-premises Active Directory forest of Contoso and Fabricam. C. Configure an organization relationship between the Microsoft 365 tenants of Fabricam and Contoso. D. In the Azure AD tenant of Contoso, create guest accounts for the Fabricam developers. And the correct option is D. In the Azure AD tenant of Contoso, create guest accounts for the Fabricam developers. You can use the capabilities in Azure Active Directory B2B to collaborate with external guest users, and you can use Azure RBAC to grant just the permissions that guest users need in your environment. Next, question number 7. You have an Azure subscription that contains the storage accounts shown in the following table. Columns: name, type, performance. And for storage 1, type storage v2 with standard performance. Storage 2 with type storage v2 with premium performance. Storage 3 with type blob storage with standard performance. Storage 4 with type file storage with premium performance. You plan to implement 2 new apps that have the requirements shown in the following table. Columns: name, requirement. App 1 has the requirement to use Lifecycle management to migrate app data between storage tiers. App 2 to store app data in an Azure file share. Which storage account should you recommend using for each app? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. For app 1, it's storage 1 and storage 3 only. It needs to use standard accounts. Data stored in a premium blob storage account cannot be tiered to hot, cool, or archive using set blob tier or using Azure Blob Storage Lifecycle Management. And for app 2, it's storage 1 and storage 4 only. Azure File Share requires premium accounts. Only storage 1 and storage 4 are premium. Next, question number 8. You are planning an Azure storage solutions for sensitive data. The data will be accessed daily. The dataset is less than 10 GB. You need to recommend a storage solution that meets the following requirements. First requirement, all the data written to storage must be retained for 5 years. Second requirement, once the data is written, the data can only be read. Modifications and deletion must be prevented. Third requirement, after 5 years, the data can be deleted but never modified. Fourth requirement, data access charges must be minimized. What should you recommend? To answer, select the appropriate options in the answer area. Answer area for storage account type, options are general purpose V2 with archive access tier for blobs, general purpose V2 with cool access tier for blobs, general purpose V2 with hot access tier for blobs. And for configuration to prevent modifications and deletions, options are container access level, container access policy, storage account resource lock. And for storage account type, it's general purpose V2 with hot access tier for blobs. Here the note is all the data written to storage must be retained for 5 years. Data access charges must be minimized. Hot tier has higher storage costs but lower access and transaction costs. And for configuration to prevent modifications and deletion, it's storage account resource lock. As an administrator, you can lock a subscription, resource group, or resource to prevent other users in your organization from accidentally deleting or modifying critical resources. The lock overrides any permissions the user might have. Next, question number 9. You have an on-premises Microsoft SQL Server database named SQL1. You plan to migrate SQL1 to Azure. You need to recommend a hosting solution for SQL1. The solution must meet the following requirements. First requirement, support the deployment of multiple secondary read-only replicas, support automatic replication between primary and secondary replicas, support failover between primary and secondary replicas within a 15-minute recovery time objective. What should you include in the solution? Answer area, for Azure Service or Service tier, options are Azure SQL Database, Azure SQL Managed Instance, the Hyperscale Service tier. And for replication mechanism, options are active geo-replication, auto failover groups, standard geo-replication. And the correct answer for Azure Service or Service tier, it's Azure SQL Database. And for replication mechanism, it's active geo-replication. For read-only replicas, read scale with 1 to 4 high availability replicas or 1 to 30 named replicas and 0 to 4 geo replicas. To support 15 minutes RTO, only manual failover can meet the requirements. Manual database failover refers to failover of a single database to its geo-replicated secondary using the unplanned mode. Next, question number 10. Your company develops a web service that is deployed to an Azure virtual machine named VM1. Service allows an IP1 to access real-time data from VM1. The current virtual machine deployment is shown in the deployment exhibit. We have VM1 and VM2 in subnet 1, and we have another prod subnet, and both subnets belongs to VNet 1. The Chief Technology Officer sends you the following email message. Our developers have deployed the web service to a virtual machine named VM1. Testing has shown that the API is accessible from VM1 and VM2. Our partners must be able to connect to the API over the internet. Partners will use this data in applications that they develop. You deploy an Azure API management service. The relevant API management configuration is shown in the API exhibit. Virtual network external location West Europe and virtual network VNet1 and subnet prod subnet. For each of the following statements, select yes if the statement is true, otherwise select no. Answer area, for the first statement, the API is available to partners over the internet. Option is yes, because we are using an Azure API management deployed to a VNet but configured to be external. Second statement, Azure API management instance can access real-time data from VM1. Option is yes, because Azure API management is deployed in the same VNet as VM1, just in a different subnet. Communication between subnets are enabled by default. Third statement, a VPN gateway is required for partner access, and the option is no. VPN required because Azure API management is accessible from the internet by virtue of it being configured as external. Thank you for watching part 4 of Azure Solutions Architect Real Exam Questions and Answers. We hope you found it informative and helpful. If you liked the video, please like, share, subscribe and comment to our channel and for more related topics. We look forward to continuing the journey with you in next videos. Thank you.